In the last lecture, we created our first object, but we're far from finished. Because one of the things that is really unique to objects is the capability to talk to ourselves. Now, when you think about it, when I'm talking inside of my head, which I do quite often, I don't say, "Hey Ben, how are you doing?" I just ask myself, "How am I doing?" And that's exactly what we're going to learn about in this lesson. And by the way, this is one of the more complicated topics that you're going to find throughout the whole training in general. So we're going to start easy, but we're going to see this over and over. And really what we're talking about is something that's called scope. And in many ways, when we're talking about scope, we're talking about the question of what is this? Where are we right now? Who owns us, really? And many times, that's all you have to ask yourself to be able to figure out a lot of bugs, is when you see something unexpected happening, just ask yourself, who do I belong to if I was that specific line of code? And a lot of times, just answering that question would solve most of your bugs. So let's go ahead, jump right in it, and meet the whole concept of scope. We created a clock in the last lesson. But really, we still have a few problems, and I want to talk about one of them, and throughout this chapter, we're going to solve most of the problems that we have. Now, if we go back into our code, one problem that we have is that we left our format digits as just a function that stands on its own. And we really don't want that. We want that function to be part of our clock. For one reason is, in future chapters, we're going to learn about inheritance. And with inheritance, we'll be able to create different variations of the format digits depending on what clock it is. But right now, it's completely separate from it, makes it impossible for us to create different interpretations of it. And beyond that, also adding the complexity of if you're sending this project out, then someone needs to have a lot of loose functions that should only belong to this clock. Lucky for us, the process of adding that method is very similar. We literally would just approach that object that we just created, the clock object, copy that function. Just going to copy it right in there. Copy that name more accurately. Set the equal sign, say the word function, and we've just created a new method. Exactly that simple, and adding that semicolon to make sure that everyone knows that this line has just completed. Now, our application is not going to work just as it is right now, because if I save this and click on a refresh, we're going to see that we have a small problem. For one is it's not going to find that digital format anymore because it's not a function. But we have another secondary problem, and that is living inside of this function, inside of this method, it doesn't really have access to the object name because that object doesn't have a name when you're inside of it. Moreover than that, we're going to have a lot of functions. So how do we actually refer to another method that belongs to the same object? And that is the main topic of this lesson, and it's incredibly simple. Instead of calling format digits, I'm going to use the keywords this and then dot. By doing that, I'm basically saying to the method, I'm saying to update clock, find the format digits inside of the object itself, because this will give back whatever this object is. Doesn't really matter what the name is. And we always want to avoid calling ourselves inside of ourselves. Just think about it. It would be incredibly confusing if we would do that. Beyond the fact that it would stop us from being able to make our code dynamic. The less that we hard code things inside of our methods, the better. And in this case, just by putting the word this dot, we're basically making sure that it's going to find the method inside of the same object. Now, I'm going to do the same thing also to the format digits that is in the line below. This, well, it's in the same line, but word wrapped below. And this dot. And if I go ahead and save this and run my application one more time, it should be back to normal and back to working. So one thing that we could see that it's definitely working the first time around, but it's not working any time after that. So there was absolutely no typo. And the way I know that it worked is because right now, the right time, it showed us the current time. But every second after that it's being called, it's not, which is a perfect opportunity to talk about another thing related to scope. Because we're calling the set interval update clock, and we're calling it every 1,000 milliseconds, the first time it actually gets there after a second, this time, this one works. Because we're inside of the method, it knows what this is. But when I call the set interval, and I'm just going to put here a console.log, so we could literally see it. If I log out this, first time around, it's going to showcase itself. Second time around, it's not going to showcase itself, but instead of that, it's going to throw an error. And notice what it's actually showing. It's showing us the window itself. In other words, when I'm calling the set interval, the scope itself, what this actually means, changes. And we want to figure out a way how to undo that change. And you don't have anything to worry about it because it's quite easy, although a little bit weird. Now, the reason why it cannot find itself is very simple. When I call directly this method, and I'm calling it all the way with the full name encapsulated, I'm basically removing that method from the object and sending it to the send interval in many ways. So when the send interval is calling it again, it's calling it as a function. And when it's a function, it's not really a method. It doesn't have access to the this anymore. To solve that problem, I could create an anonymous function just by typing here function and opening and closing a bracket around it and then triggering the function from inside. Now, the idea behind this is I'm sending the function, which is just a regular function, and when that function executes, is going to call that update clock as a method. Now again, the reason why I could put here C is because we're living inside of the same function, and because we just created this object, it's going to have access to that scope forever. And it doesn't matter if we create 100 clocks, because each time it's going to be a different variable, but this function will always have access to everything that's inside of the function that is above him. Contrary to that, the keyword this is detached. It's a dynamic keyword. It wouldn't find itself. So if I go ahead and I save this and I click on again and refresh my application, we should see that now our clock is also going to update and we're not going to have any issues. Now this is a very advanced topic and it's okay if it looks a little bit weird, but it should be logical. The idea behind it is this will basically give us access to whoever owns it. Now, if I go ahead and I just grab this function and just send it around, I'm going to lose the scope, because I'm sending it through a set interval. So for me to enable JavaScript to know that when I'm actually calling this update clock, it's a method and not a function, I need to trigger it as a method and not as a function. And literally, I'm just wrapping a function just to help me to make sure that the set interval doesn't call this as a function, but it calls it as a method. And this is a very common workaround that you're going to see in JavaScript in general. All right, so that's it. In the next lesson, we're going to take a step deeper and walk a little bit deeper into the creation of our object, where we're going to actually go back to trying to actually put in different time zones like we talked about in the previous lesson.